Welcome, everybody. At least this time it's good evening rather than good morning. Today, the Council has tackled three issues: how we boost growth across Europe, how the Eurozone countries are going to strengthen their fiscal rules, and how the European Union must increase the pressure on Assad's murderous regime. Let me take each in turn. Let me start with growth. This was rightly the focus of today's meeting. It has to be our number one priority, not just today, but every time we meet. My message to other leaders was clear. We've got to be bold and decisive. EU action should match the ambition that we are showing back at home. So it's a step forward, I believe, that we've agreed today to accelerate the legislation that will do the most to generate growth, to consider a clear plan at our March summit to cut red tape, to remove barriers to trade in services right across the EU, and to make it easier to do business online, the so-called digital single market, across a market with 500 million customers. And we agreed this must be a decisive year to get trade moving with those big deals we want to make with India, Japan, the US and others. These are all good steps forward. They are things that the UK has been asking for years in many cases, and they're now firmly on the agenda. Second, on the Eurozone. Eurozone members and others have today agreed a new treaty focused on tighter fiscal discipline, which we understand is important. Now, this is a totally separate treaty. That is because we vetoed an EU treaty in December. We are not signing this treaty, we will not be ratifying this treaty, and it places no obligations on the United Kingdom. But as I said in December, this is new territory. It's only been agreed today. It is yet to be ratified or implemented. There are a number of legal concerns on the use of EU institutions. Now, we don't want to hold up the Eurozone doing what is necessary to solve the crisis as long as it doesn't damage our national interest. So it's good that the new treaty is absolutely explicit and clear that it cannot encroach on the competences of the European Union, and they must not take measures that in any way undermine the EU single market. But I made clear today we will watch this closely, and if necessary, we are able to take action if our national interests are threatened. And let me say this, while tough fiscal discipline is obviously important for the Eurozone, it is still vital that the Eurozone countries recapitalise their banks, end the uncertainty around Greece, and establish a firewall big enough to deal with the crisis. These measures cannot wait. The risks are still too great. They are the immediate steps necessary if the single currency is to succeed. Finally, on Syria. It is, frankly, an appalling situation. More than 5,000 people killed, 400 children murdered, tens of thousands detained. Tomorrow, the Foreign Secretary will go to New York to support the Arab League's call for Security Council action, condemning the repression and supporting a transition of power. Today, all 27 EU members back that call for UN action in a move that was led by the UK. And if the violence doesn't end there, we will tighten the EU sanctions. Our message is clear. We will stand with the Syrian people, and it's time for all the members of the UN Security Council to live up to their responsibilities instead of shielding those who have blood on their hands. So we'll be making a very strong stand at the UN Security Council tomorrow, led by William Hague. Time for questions. Let's start with Tom Bradbury.
Prime Minister, should decisions on Mr Hester's pay and conditions be taken or overseen by the RBS board or by you? And if the answer is the board, why haven't you encouraged him to take the bonus he was awarded?
Well, the arrangements were put in place by the last government. That's the arrangements to hire Stephen Hester, the arrangement for the payment of bonuses, for the role of the board, the role of the remuneration committee, and all of that. They decided to put this on a commercial basis, to have an arm's-length agreement with UK FI, who are going to represent the government's interests. Of course, there is a role for shareholders, and we made very clear our view about the level of bonus, which is why it radically came down. I think the main thing that needs to happen is for this bank to be turned round, for its balance sheet to be made safe, and for the taxpayers' money, vitally, to be recovered. I want to make sure that every penny piece that went into that bank, we get back out when we eventually sell down our stake. That is absolutely vital. Now, of course, we'll look closely at the arrangements that were put in place. We don't plan to change them. We'll look closely at them, but I think it's very important that this bank operates under those arrangements.
You haven't answered my question. My point was, why in that case did you not encourage Mr Hester to take the bonus he'd been awarded?
Well, the point I made, as it were, on behalf of the shareholder, and the point the Chancellor made very vigorously, was that they needed to show restraint in bonuses, and that is exactly what I said. I said that if he was going to get a bonus, it should be nothing like last year. That is the role of the shareholder. Then the role of the board, as the arm's length principle, is to look at the performance and reach a judgment. And then it is up to the individual whether they take the bonus. So everyone, if you like, has played their part. Some of them have done it in slightly interesting ways, if I can put it that way. Those are the arrangements that were put in place by the last government. Those are the ones that we're currently operating. But, of course, we can look closely at all of that and more. Nick.
Nick Watt from The Guardian. Prime Minister, you've just told us that the United Kingdom is unlikely to stand in the way of the European Court of Justice being used to police the new fiscal compact if it deals with the fiscal compact. If it tries to rewrite the single market, then obviously you'll have something to say about that. Do you regret having put the EU institutions in the frame? Because some of your colleagues are saying that your decision now is annulling that veto in December. And secondly, on another matter, I think a few weeks ago you briefed Aung San Suu Kyi on how you would be raising the recent developments in Burma at this summit. Are you happy with the response that you've got from your fellow EU leaders on those recent developments in Burma?
Well, first on the second question, I spoke to Aung San Suu Kyi at the weekend and asked her about how quickly she thought the re-engagement process should take place between countries in the West, countries in the EU, with the Burmese regime. And I think it's very important that we listen carefully to her, an absolute figure of brilliance in terms of what she has been through and what she's now going to achieve in that country. And I think the message is, yes, we should be engaging, but we should do it in stages, and we should look very carefully to make sure that the by-elections they're going to hold are fair, that prisoners go on being released, that they go on opening up and moving towards democracy. And as they do that, I think there are opportunities for European Union countries to engage, and I'm delighted that the Council has made such a clear statement tonight. On the issue of the veto, look, nothing changes the fact that we were confronted by an EU treaty and we vetoed that treaty. So there was the Nice Treaty, there was the Maastricht Treaty, there was the Amsterdam Treaty, all EU treaties. Well, there isn't a Brussels EU treaty because I vetoed it. It doesn't exist. They've had to make a treaty outside the EU. Now, obviously, they'd prefer to have it inside the EU, which is why they're already talking about trying to bring it back inside the EU. So to argue that the veto doesn't matter seems to me to be bizarre. We're not in this treaty, we're not part of it, we're not bound by it, we don't have to ratify it, we don't take it to the British Parliament. That is what the veto secures you. On the issue of the institutions, we have to understand the EU institutions are already used in other settings, so that we're not involved in. They're used for the Eurogroup countries. They're used in Schengen. The key point here for me is what is in our national interest. Now, our national interest is that these countries get on and sort out the mess that is the euro. That's in our national interest. It's also in our national interest that the new treaty outside the EU doesn't encroach on the single market or the things that we care about. That's the outcome we want to achieve. So we'll be watching like a hawk. And if there's any sign that they're going to encroach on the single market, then clearly we would, we would take the appropriate action, if I can put it that way. But if they're going to stick to fiscal union issues and all the things they're planning to do, then that's an outcome Britain is comfortable with. But the principle that the EU institutions can only be used when there's permission of all 27, that is absolutely safeguarded and hasn't changed, and that's why we've reserved our position. And we're using that reserve to watch over this treaty and say, inasmuch as this is about fiscal union, fine. Start to encroach on the single market, not fine. So very clear national interest. Don't sign the treaty without the safeguards, so there isn't an EU treaty, point one. Make sure the new treaty is restricted to the fiscal union, point two. Hold back the position on the institutions so you've got some real leverage over what these countries will do in that treaty. But say to your colleagues and friends and partners in the European Union, in the Eurozone, please get on and sort out what's going wrong in the Eurozone, because this is doing damage to Britain.